This is the podcast for week 7 on chapters 12 and 13, which have to do with metro government and community power. So let's get started with the questions. The first one is the type of metro government. The actual question is, what are the most common methods of metro reform? So if we look at metro reform, I've got this diagram here, and starting with the far left, the weakest or the smallest or the minimal change in the metropolitan area government structure to the most extreme at the far left. I mean, at the far right. So the far left starts with annexation. And annexation simply means that the existing government, some existing government like the city, will incorporate or take on some area outside the city and make it part of the city. That's what annexation is. So you may have an area outside of the city limits of, say, Joliet or Lockport or someplace like that, and currently that area is in the county, not in the city. And by a joint vote, a vote first of the city council of, say, the city of Joliet, and then the vote of the people living in the area outside the city. If both decide, majority of both decide to that they want to be part of the existing city, and the reason the voters would want to do it would be to get city services like streets and sewer and garbage pickup and things like that if they're provided by the city. And the city would want to do it because it would increase their tax base, get more people paying taxes to the city. So annexation, if both decided to vote in favor of joining the city council decided to vote the group in, and the voters decided to vote themselves as part of the city, then it would become automatically change the geographical boundary of the city, and that previously unincorporated area would now become part of the city, and that's what's called annexation. The second type is voluntary cooperation, and you see a lot of this kind of thing, especially in areas where the service is very much expensive, or maybe a jurisdiction doesn't want to duplicate what somebody else has. So you may have two cities and they decide to cooperate. An example of something that's expensive would be medical emergency equipment, like, for example, an ambulance or first responder people. So what they would do would be that the existing city that has it, usually that's the largest city, would probably already have ambulance service or first responders for medical emergencies, those kind of things. And that's a big deal these days, especially since so many people have heart attacks, that if the first responders can get there in time, they can oftentimes save somebody when they have their initial heart attack. Usually after that it's not so successful, but the first time it can be. Anyway, you get volunteer cooperation. Say you had the city of Joliet and the city of Romeoville deciding that they wanted to voluntarily cooperate in terms of maybe buying the equipment, the ambulance, paying for the training of the first responders in the medical emergency. And if one of the cities already has the equipment, then the other city would just pay for it, pay part of the expenses, and then the medical team would go out to both cities instead of just one. So you have this kind of voluntary cooperation where things are very expensive. Another area would be firefighting. That's another thing where it's very expensive equipment, hundreds of thousands of dollars for those trucks and so on. So they might decide to voluntarily cooperate with each other and cut the expenses down. Another area you might have is like a library, where maybe one city, like the city of Joliet, has a pretty good sized library, and then Romeoville and Crest Hill and other places like that have much smaller libraries. What they could do is they could pay, I don't think they do this now, but they could pay the city of Joliet a certain fee per card holder, um, and then allow people from Crest Hill and Lockport to use the Joliet Library. So it's things like that are voluntary cooperation. Again, this doesn't really change the structure of government, but it is a form of reform in the metropolitan area, just like annexation. Then the next type, and obviously this is the most common type, we talked about the Regional Transportation Authority in the six-county area around Chicago, um, as a example of special district. And so the RTA, that's what we talked about. That special district is a metropolitan special district. I don't think I said it at the time, but it is, and it's pretty common that you would have several counties or several jurisdictions um, sharing in a special district. And the reason, as I said before, that you would do that would be largely to increase the tax base and to spread out the cost of some expensive thing like public transportation. Public transportation is very expensive because you have these big buses and trains and so on, which are very expensive to build and to keep in service, and largely in a society where most people drive their cars. So special districts like metropolitan transportation districts are very, very common across the United States. So and that's the main kind of metropolitan change in government, where you create a special government just for one function, but it includes a large area, usually surrounding a big city like Chicago, and the Regional Transportation Authority as a good example. The last two are specific types of metro changes, where you fundamentally change the structure of government that exists. One is called a metro federation, and that's where you set up a federation, just like the national government, the relationship between the national government and the states. You would set up that kind of setup in the local area. So you'd have a metropolitan government, which would be correspond to like a national government, usually at the county level, and then the cities within the county would stay in business, but they would have less function, um, and they would be part of the federation. So instead of having the national government in the states, you now have a county government and city governments, and their relationship to each other is very similar to the relationship between the national government and the states, in a kind of existence in a kind of federation. So that kind of thing you find in a few places in the United States. Metropolitan government as such, that is metro federation and city county consolidation, those things have not really caught on in the United States, largely because existing governments don't trust the idea of going out of business and having some metropolitan government running the show. So anyway, you have that kind of thing in a few places throughout the United States. There's some examples of it in your book. City-county consolidation is the most radical or most fundamentally changing of the reforms, and what that is where the city and county come together to form a government, and that government runs the metropolitan area. So those are what we call metropolitan reforms, and like I said, you can see examples of them in your book. I won't talk any more about that now. The second question is, what are the uh, what are the arguments in favor of metropolitan reform? And I listed some here. Um, People who advocate metropolitan reform say it'll reduce the cost of government. In other words, what it's going to do is it's going to consolidate government, bring government together, so you have fewer entities, and therefore it should be less expensive. Like I said once before, I never trust anybody who says they're going to reduce the cost of government. Um, but anyway, that's one of the arguments. A second thing is more equity in the tax burden. That is, the tax burden is shared uh, over a larger geographical area. So, like we said, with the metropolitan, the uh, Regional Transportation Authority, you have 6 counties, and therefore the tax burden is spread out. It isn't just the people of Chicago having to pay the enormous amount of money for the, the Transportation Authority in Chicago. Um, so anyway, the tax burden is spread out. Focus of responsibility is something that happens whenever you consolidate government too. People can see who's in power, can see who has the control, can see who has the responsibility, and that's important. That becomes more important in a democracy because if people don't know who's really running it, who's really responsible, they don't know who to blame when things go wrong, and therefore they can't really be in control because democracy means that the public is in control, and the only way they can be in control is if they understand what's going on. And in a federated system like we have with 86,000 local governments, it would be hard to understand what's really who's really responsible for anything. Um, and then the final thing is it enables public services such as planning. In other words, you should be able to handle problems better if you have a wider geographical area to deal with. So, um, like for example, one of the problems that exists with transportation or pollution or any of the big issues that face any metropolitan area, crime and so on, is that if you have a limited jurisdiction, control over a very small jurisdiction, it isn't going to, you're not going to be able to control problems like traffic. The traffic that's fed into the city of Chicago by people working in the city that are fed from the suburbs, the city doesn't have any control over those suburbs. So, what can they do about decreasing the traffic problem? Same thing with crime. You can have a very strong gun control law in the city of Chicago, and then people can go right outside the city limits, go into Indiana or someplace like that, just a short drive away, and be able to buy guns. And if you can do that, then bring them back in the city. The gun laws of Chicago really don't mean anything except to punish people when they get caught. So the whole concept is that if you really wanted gun control, that if you had a regional government that could handle that problem, then they would have widespread gun control laws, and therefore be able to manage the problem much better. If same thing with traffic or pollution or anything else you can think of that you could call a metropolitan problem. So if you the argument always is if you have metropolitan problems, that is some problem like crime or transportation or pollution or whatever that crosses geographical boundaries, that is goes beyond say the city limits of the city of Chicago, um, then if you got a problem like that, then you need metro reform in order to solve the problem. That's essentially the argument. Um, what's the difference between elite and pluralism? Um, I think I asked a question. I don't know why it's listed as number 2 here, but um, what's the difference between elitism and pluralism? This should have been 3, not 2. Anyway, let's just go on with it. Um, in terms of elitism, what elitism says is that society is divided along class lines. There's the upper class, and then there's the rest of people. In other words, power is generated by economic control. It's sort of like the essential argument. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's the essential argument made by Marxism. I don't want to say communism because communism is more complicated than Marxism. But if you ever read the Communist Manifesto, you know what I'm talking about. Um, so the first thing is that society is divided along class lines, the upper class and then everybody else. Secondly, there's the all important decisions are made by a few, by the elite. In other words, this is where conspiracy theories really come in. People believe in elitism. They believe that elites make decisions. So you've got a small group of people, they're the economic elite, and they make decisions. They have all the power and they make the decisions. Usually the concept is they're behind the scenes. They're the people in control of the economy of the local area, and they make the decisions. And like the mayor and the city council and those kinds of people are just sort of fronting for these elites. Power is highly concentrated among those who have the vast wealth. So that's basically what I said. If you own the wealth, and I mean this is the big time people, like the people who have who generate most of the jobs in a city, like they own the factory or they own the retail stores or whatever it is that's generating the most jobs and the most money in the local area. The elite have a monopoly of the most important resources, and here this is how the elites and the pluralists differ, because the idea is that the resources of wealth are what really count. This is the most important thing, that the most important thing that counts are money, property, stocks and bonds, which all kind of, generate into just saying money, that they control what's going on because they control the money. And public policy benefits the wealthy. That is, whatever the government does, it benefits the wealthy, the elites, at the expense of everybody else. So somebody would argue, for example, that the tax structure, where the 1%, you remember when they had the Wall Street March and all that kind of stuff, that the 1% are the ones really making the profits. They're the ones really getting the wealth of the country, and everybody else is kind of getting screwed. That's elitism in a nutshell. And pluralism is the opposite of that. Pluralism says interest groups, not economic elites, are in control of government. So it says, that if you look at the power is in interest groups in the United States, and that's what the pluralists would say. And that doesn't mean that the interest groups don't have an economic base. In other words, like you've got the American Medical Association representing the economic interest of the doctors, and you've got the American Farm Bureau representing the economic interest of the farmers. The difference is, it's not that they're arguing that economics isn't important. What they're arguing is that it's more spread out. Pluralism means a wide variety of people share power. And so what they're saying is that if you look at interest groups, there's a lot of them. It isn't just interest groups that form a small cadre of people who have the same interests. It's a whole variety of interests that play off each other. The farmers are against the doctors, who are against the lawyers, and so on and so forth, all the way down the line. So number two, interest groups compete with one another and produce a compromise policy that tends to be good for the many. So rather than the public policy being just good for the 1%, the public policy is said to be good for everybody, because that's what compromise does. It's a system. Compromise is a system where nobody gets their way. Everybody gets some piece of the pie, and therefore, in a sense, that's good for the common good. Um, Third, and here there's a difference again between the elites and the pluralists, there's a diversity of resources useful in political life besides wealth. So it's not just all about money. There's the ability to mobilize voters, for example, work in campaigns, um, doing things that people can do that don't have money, voting, getting voting blocks together, that kind of thing. And then pluralists are optimistic that the public interest will prevail. There's a sense kind of going back, way back to Rousseau. I don't know if you've ever studied political theory, but the idea of Rousseau was that the many always win out and the common good is served and all of that kind of thing. Um, in our day of cynicism, alienation, so on, a lot of this pluralism looks like pie in the sky. And to most of us living in the 21st century, we probably would think would align more with the elitist arguments. But I'll leave that to you. The last one is what makes more sense and why. So you have to decide whether you think pluralism makes more sense or elitism makes more sense. Political scientists in general tend to be pluralists. They tend to be people who kind of believe that the system of democracy really works in the United States because interest groups play off one another. Um, so practical politics wins out over ideology. That's harder and harder to believe if you're paying attention to politics in our time in the 21st century, because ideology just seems to be dominating. You've got um, not necessarily a majority of the Republican Party that are in the Congress right now. You've got the Republicans dominating the House and the Senate, but you've got a huge portion of them that are real ideologically bent. They're the tax reform and groups of people that are Tea Party types and all of that, and so they're more ideological. That is, they're not so bent toward compromising. They don't want to compromise, and that's kind of strange. And because for 200 years we've been compromising in terms of different interests because we haven't been very ideological. One of the ways you could describe America as a country that's more pragmatic than ideological, but that seems to be changing. But again, you can make up your own mind, decide whether you think it makes more sense. Look at those arguments as I presented them. And you can find other places online where they'll describe pluralism and elitism, and there's a description in the book, and decide what choice, what side you tend to fall on. Just make sure that when you pick a side, when you're talking about it, that you use examples of what you see as pluralism or elitism. Okay, I think I said enough about this stuff.